At my father's will reading, everyone already knew the script. My golden boy brother would get the empire, and I'd get the crumbs. Then my grandfather's old lawyer unlocked a briefcase, slid out a sealed envelope with my name on it, and the room stopped breathing. By the time I walked into my father's lawyer's office that gray November morning, my palms were already slick with sweat inside my sleeves. I remember the smell first. Old paper, polished wood, and the faint citrus of some expensive cleaner. The kind of smell that always meant serious business in my father's world. I'd smelled it in his study, in boardrooms, in the bank when he dragged us along to sign loan papers. It was the smell of decisions, of power. This time, that power had nothing to do with me. At least, that's what everyone in my family had already decided. I'm Daniel Hayes, 31 years old, second son, the difficult one, as my mother liked to say when she thought I couldn't hear. My older brother Eric was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. The one everybody assumed would walk out of that room with everything my father and grandfather had ever built. I was just there to fill a chair and sign whatever scraps they decided were safe to toss my way. Don't slouch, Daniel. We're not at some coffee shop, my mother hissed under her breath as we stood in the paneled waiting room, her manicured fingers fussing with the pearl button of her coat. She was in full performance mode, dark navy suit, hair sprayed into a helmet, lipstick just a little too red for a funeral week. Next to her, Eric lounged in the leather chair as if it were his birthright, one ankle resting casually on his knee, that lazy smirk he'd inherited from my father plastered on his face. "You nervous, little brother?" he asked, not even bothering to lower his voice. "It's just paperwork." Dad was always clear about how this would go. He didn't have to say it. I'd heard the same line since I was old enough to spell my own name. Family businesses go to the eldest. That's tradition, Danny. You'll understand when you're older. I'd been hearing, "You'll understand when you're older" my whole life. Then one day you wake up in your 30s, standing in your dead father's lawyer's office, and realize all older gave you was clarity, not comfort. Behind the heavy oak door, I could hear muffled voices. Mr. Keller, my father's long-time attorney. Another voice, deeper, unfamiliar. Paper rustling. A door closing. Eric checked his watch and sighed theatrically. They better not drag this out too long. I've got a call with Munich at 3. Of course he did. Eric lived in the rhythm of conference calls and closing bells. He'd been groomed for it since he was born, sitting on our grandfather's lap, listening to stories not about dragons or pirates, but about margin calls and hostile takeovers. I had stories, too, just not the kind anyone in my family wanted to hear. "Stop boasting," my mother said, but there was pride in her eyes when she glanced at him. "You know how your grandfather hated when we bragged in public." She said we, but she meant you. My mother had never in her life missed an opportunity to drop a hint about our last name, about the empire my grandfather, then my father, had built out of nothing. Except it hadn't been nothing. It had been him. My grandfather, Henry Hayes, the man everyone pretended was just the first chapter so they could talk about my father's vision. In the sliding layers of this family, I'd always felt closest to the one on the bottom, the foundation stone nobody bothered to polish anymore. The office door opened with a soft click. "Mrs. Hayes?" Mr. Keller appeared, gray-haired, tie precisely knotted. His eyes flicked over us, lingering on me for half a beat longer than felt comfortable. "We're ready for you." My mother straightened, smoothing her skirt. Eric rolled his shoulders, as if stepping into a ring he'd already been assured he'd win. I just picked up the pen someone had left on the side table and turned it between my fingers, feeling the cheap plastic flecks. Something to keep my hands busy. As we followed Mr. Keller down the short corridor, my eyes traced the framed certificates lining the walls. Law degrees, bar admissions, a photograph of him shaking hands with my father outside a courthouse. I wondered what they'd talked about that day. If there'd been laughter. If my father had smirked that same way Eric did now. In the conference room, 2 chairs had already been taken. One by Aunt Cheryl, my father's younger sister, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. The other by a man I didn't recognize, late 50s, broad-shouldered despite the tailored suit, a heavy leather briefcase at his feet. He stood when we entered, eyes sharp but not unkind. "Thank you for coming," Mr. Keller said formally, sliding into the seat at the head of the table. "We'll begin once everyone is settled." My mother glided to the chair on his right like she owned the place. Eric took the seat next to her. That left me the spot at the far end of the table, near the window where the winter light turned everything cold and flat. I sat. The chair creaked slightly under my weight. Even the furniture in this room seemed to protest my presence. The stranger cleared his throat. "For those who don't know me," he said, voice smooth with the faintest southern edge, "I'm Jonathan Blake. I've been your grandfather Henry's attorney for the last 25 years." Aunt Cheryl gave a small nod. My mother's back went a fraction straighter. Eric barely reacted. Of course he knew him. Eric had been invited to the grown-up tables long before I was old enough to understand what was being carved on them. "It's good to see you again, Mrs. Hayes," Jonathan added, with a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. My mother returned it, that politician's smile she used at charity galas. "We appreciate you being here, Mr. Blake." Henry was very particular about these things. Indeed he was. I watched them, feeling like I'd stepped into a play halfway through the second act. I knew my grandfather had his own lawyer. Everyone with money did, but I'd never seen the man before. Then again, there were a lot of rooms I'd never been invited into. "As you know," Mr. Keller began, folding his hands on the leather blotter, "we're here today to read the last will and testament of your late father, Robert Hayes." The word still sounded wrong. Late father, as if referring to a package that had missed its delivery window. It had been 3 weeks since the heart attack. 3 weeks since my mother had called, her voice sharp and controlled as she said, "It's your father. He's gone. The service will be Friday." No sobbing, no crack in her tone, just information, delivered like an item on a to-do list. I'd stood there in my tiny kitchen, staring at the half-eaten bowl of cereal on the counter, and felt nothing. Not at first. Grief seeped in slowly, like water under a door. I wasn't sure if I was mourning the man he was, or the father I'd always wanted him to be. "I'd like to state, for the record," Mr. Keller continued, "that this document was executed and notarized in my presence 18 months ago. Multiple drafts were made prior to that, but this is the final version. 18 months. A year and a half before his heart simply decided it had carried enough. Had he known? Had he felt the ticking in his chest and thought, I should put this in order? Or had it just been another strategic move, another line item in his empire management? Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my mother's lips curve. Not a smile exactly, more like satisfaction settling into a familiar groove. Eric shifted in his chair, already leaning forward as if to catch every word that mattered. Nobody looked at me. That was familiar, too. If you grow up as the shadow child, you get used to seeing the backs of people's heads. The way they angle themselves toward the light, toward the center, leaving you with scraps of expression and half-heard conversations. It had started early. When we were kids, birthdays were like holidays in our house. Not because of the cake or the presents, but because of the way the air changed around them. When it was Eric's birthday, the whole extended family descended. Grandfather would arrive with a wrapped box the size of my torso, my father with tickets to some game in a city we had to fly to. People raised glasses, toasted to the future of Hayes Holdings, ruffled his hair, and called him our little CEO. On my birthdays, they were nice. There was a cake, maybe a soccer ball, or a book. My parents didn't forget exactly. They just didn't see the point of making a production out of it. "He doesn't like fuss," my mother would say if anyone asked why the dining room was quiet on my day. As if she'd ever asked me. It was always like that. Report cards, school plays, trophies. When Eric made varsity, there was a party. When I got a scholarship to a state college 3 hours away, my father glanced at the letter and said, "Good. At least you're not wasting money." If Eric missed a curfew, my parents sat him down for a serious conversation about responsibility and trust. When I was late once because my car broke down, my mother locked the door and left me sleeping in the garage just to teach me a lesson. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. That's not the point. I'm telling you because it's important you understand. What happened in that room didn't come out of nowhere. It was the final scene of a story that had been writing itself, line by line, for decades. The only person who'd ever broken the pattern was my grandfather. Henry Hayes lived in a modest brick house 10 minutes from our mansion. No gates, no circular driveway, just a neatly trimmed hedge and a front porch with a swing that creaked when you pushed off too hard. He drove the same rusty pickup he'd had since before I was born, even after my father begged him to, "At least get something that doesn't leak oil everywhere, Dad." He'd just wave him off. "The truck runs." That's good enough. You want to impress people, buy yourself another Mercedes. When I was little and the pressure in our house got too tight, he'd call my mother and say, Daniel's coming over to help me with the garden. He didn't ask. He told. And she never argued with him. Not out loud, anyway. At his place, I wasn't the second son, the disappointment. I was just Daniel, the kid who could climb the old oak tree faster than anyone else. The one who knew how his grandfather liked his coffee. The person he trusted to hold the flashlight while he fixed that damn truck for the 100th time. Your father means well, he'd say sometimes, lips quirking as he wiped grease off his hands. He just got lost in the numbers. Forgets people have more in them than quarterly reports. He never mouthed my parents. Not once. But he saw me. Really saw me. The way a craftsman looks at a piece of wood and sees what it could become, not just what it is. When I chose to study social work instead of business, my father didn't speak to me for 3 months. My mother shook her head and told everyone, Daniel just doesn't have a head for numbers. He'll find his place eventually, I'm sure. Grandfather showed up at my tiny dorm room on moving day with a toolbox and a box of his old flannel shirts. In case the heating's as bad as it was in my day, he said, dumping the shirts on my unmade bed. Then he opened the toolbox, pulled out a small envelope and pressed it into my hand. For emergencies, he said, eyes holding mine in that steady way that always made me feel both safe and slightly exposed. Grandpa, I can't. Wasn't asking, he cut me off. Sometimes you need a little cushion to make brave choices. Consider it an investment. Inside was a check. Not huge, but enough to cover a few months of rent if I ever needed it. I never told my parents about it. I never needed to use it either. But I kept that envelope, yellowing at the edges, at the back of my desk drawer all through college. A talisman. Proof that someone believed I had the right to choose my own path. When he died 2 years before my father, the funeral was small. He'd insisted on it. No cameras. No speeches. Put me in the ground, and then go have a beer, he'd told me with a chuckle one afternoon, sitting on that porch swing, the chain squeaking in protest. My father gave the eulogy anyway. Talked about legacy and building things with your own 2 hands. The words were right, but his eyes were dry. My mother cried delicate tears into a white handkerchief with her initials embroidered in the corner. Eric checked his watch 3 times. I stood at the back, hands in my pockets, and felt like someone had torn out the one page in my life that made sense. After the funeral, Mr. Blake, this same man now sitting across from me with his leather briefcase, had called me into a side room. Your grandfather left something for you, he'd said, handing me a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was the original deed to that rusty old truck, folded around a handwritten note. Daniel, it read, in my grandfather's crabbed script. You don't need much to get where you're going. Just something that runs, and the guts to turn the key. Proud of you. H. It should have been funny. It should have made me roll my eyes. Instead, I'd sat there in that quiet room, the sounds of the wake drifting through the wall, and cried like a child. I hadn't seen Mr. Blake again after that. I knew there had been more papers, more accounts, more arrangements, as my mother called them. But I was not invited to those meetings. The empire kept its own secrets. Now, sitting in this conference room, facing both my father's lawyer and my grandfather's, I felt the old weight of that exclusion settle on my shoulders again. Let's proceed, Mr. Keller said, picking up a thick envelope stamped with a notary seal. This is the last will and testament of Robert Hayes. My mother's eyes gleamed. Eric leaned forward, folding his hands on the table as if ready to accept a trophy. I stared at my reflection in the window, a man with tired eyes and a weak, old beard, wearing the only suit that still fit properly. A social worker who helped kids climb out of holes they hadn't dug, while his own family dug one around him. I told myself I didn't care what that envelope held. That money was just numbers, and I'd build a life that wasn't measured in stock options or house sizes. I thought about the kids on my caseload, about the single mom who'd hugged me last week and said, "You're the only one who listened," and I tried to draw strength from that. But when Mr. Keller slid the papers out and cleared his throat, reading my father's clipped, lawyer-approved language, I felt every muscle in my body clench. Because I did care. Not about the money. About what it said. About what it proved. About whether, after a lifetime of being told I was second best, my father had chosen to carve that judgment into something permanent. My mother caught my eye then, just for a second, and there it was. That smirk. The same one Eric wore so effortlessly. The look of someone who already knows the ending and is just waiting for everyone else to catch up. Mr. Keller adjusted his glasses, the paper crackling slightly in his hands. I, Robert Hayes, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. The legalese rolled out in that dry, practiced tone I'd heard in courtrooms and board meetings. Standard disclaimers. Revoking prior wills. Naming my mother as executor, with full discretionary authority. None of it surprised me. I watched the way my mother's chin lifted almost imperceptibly at the word executor. Power sat easily on her shoulders. To my beloved wife, Margaret Hayes, I bequeath all personal property located within our primary residence at 14 Ridgecrest Lane, including but not limited to furniture, jewelry, artwork, and vehicles, as well as a life estate interest in said residence for the duration of her natural life. My mother exhaled softly, the closest thing to a sigh of relief I'd heard from her in weeks. Life estate. It meant she could live in the house until she died, even if the deed went elsewhere. Of course, she murmured. As it should be. Eric's mouth twitched. He already knew the house would be his in the end. It had always been his, even when I still had a room there. Upon Margaret Hayes's passing, full title to the residence shall vest in my elder son, Eric Hayes. There it was. The first official coronation of the day. Eric didn't whoop or smile broadly. He just nodded once, as if this were confirmation of something already settled, not new information. For him, it was. I felt something hollow out in my chest. Not because I wanted the house. I didn't. That place was a museum of judgments and expectations. But hearing it said like that, in black and white, made it real in a way nothing else had. Father, beloved wife, elder son. I knew where I fit in that sentence. To my elder son, Eric Hayes, Mr. Keller continued, I bequeath all of my shares in Hayes Industrial Holdings, representing a controlling interest in the company, along with any and all voting rights attached thereto. My stomach clenched, even though I'd seen it coming. The company, the empire, everything that had dictated the rhythm of our lives since before I was born. Signed, sealed, delivered. Eric let out a slow breath, almost like a runner at the finish line. My mother reached over and patted his hand, her fingers lingering. Their eyes met in that wordless communication I'd grown up watching. Pride, satisfaction, victory. My father's voice echoed in my head from a night 15 years earlier. Eric had just closed his first deal, which was really just convincing a family friend to take a minor stake in a division that was already thriving. We'd been in the library, a room heavy with dark wood and heavier silences. Father had poured Eric a glass of scotch like he was knighting him. This is what we do, son, he'd said, clinking his glass against Eric's. We build. We grow. One day, all of this will be on your shoulders. I'd been standing in the doorway with a stack of textbooks, sweaty from biking home from campus. My father had glanced at me, glass halfway to his lips. And you, he'd added, almost as an afterthought. You'll make your own way. That's good too. That's good too. Like a consolation prize. Now, hearing Mr. Keller read the formal version of that moment, I felt like I was back in that doorway again, holding books nobody in this house cared about. It is my express wish, Keller read, that Eric continue to run Hayes Industrial Holdings in the spirit of integrity, innovation, and family legacy that his grandfather, Henry Hayes, and I sought to embody. My fingers tightened around the pen I was still holding, the cheap plastic digging into my skin. Family legacy. My grandfather's name, woven into a sentence that left me out. I wondered what Granddad would have said if he'd heard that line. If he'd have laughed. That short bark of amusement he used when people said something he found especially stupid. He used to say, legacy isn't what you hoard, Daniel. It's what you leave in people. Things die. People carry you. But in this room, legacy was ink on paper. Titles. Percentages. Houses. Shares. To my younger son, Daniel Hayes. The room stilled. It was the first time my name had been uttered since we sat down. It landed in the space like something fragile that could shatter if touched too roughly. I felt my pulse spike. Don't react, I told myself. Don't lean forward. Don't give them the satisfaction of seeing you care. Mr. Keller cleared his throat. There was a minuscule hesitation, like his brain had to switch tracks. I bequeath my collection of first edition books, currently housed in my private study, as well as the sum of $50,000, to be held in trust and distributed to him 30 days following the execution of this will. Silence. Then a chair creaked as Aunt Cheryl shifted, her eyes flicking toward me with something between sympathy and pity. My mother's expression didn't change. Her lips remained faintly upturned, as if this, too, was exactly as expected. Eric let out a small breath through his nose, a sound that could have been a suppressed laugh. $50,000. In this room, with these people, it might as well have been a gift card. The first editions, at least, meant something. Those books had been the only things my father and I ever came close to connecting over. On the rare quiet Sunday afternoons when the house emptied of guests, I'd sneak into his study and run my fingers over the spines. Steinbeck, Faulkner, Toni Morrison, a few slim volumes of poetry I'd been surprised to see in his collection. Once, when I was 16, he'd caught me standing there, tracing the gold lettering on an old copy of East of Eden. "You read that?" he'd asked, not unkindly. "Yeah," I'd said, half defensive. "At school." He'd nodded, then taken the book down, opened it to a dog-eared page, and handed it to me without a word. Then he'd left me there. For a second, in that room now, I could almost feel that weight in my hands again. But the money, the number, it sat between us like an accusation. I knew how this would be told, later, in hushed tones over crystal glasses. Robert was so generous. He made sure even Daniel was taken care of. A token. Enough to absolve their guilt, not enough to change anything. Heat crawled up my neck. I stared at the grain of the table, following the dark lines as if they could pull me out of myself. "Is that all?" Aunt Cheryl asked quietly. Mr. Keller shook his head and continued. "The remainder of my liquid assets, investment portfolios, and any interest not otherwise specified in this document shall be divided as follows: 60%, 60% to my wife, Margaret Hayes, and 40%, 40% to my elder son, Eric Hayes." Of course, I didn't bother doing the mental math. Whatever those percentages translated to in actual numbers, it would be more than enough to ensure they never had to worry about anything again. We'd never truly worried before, not in the way the families I worked with did. Not in the way that meant choosing between rent and food. But now, even the specter of worry had been legally banished, for them, at least. For me, nothing had really changed. I would go back to my rented apartment with its mismatched furniture. Back to my overworked colleagues and underfunded programs. Back to scraping change together for older car repairs and pretending I didn't mind when my landlord texted about the late check. I could already hear my mother's line, rehearsed and ready. "You're independent. That's what you always wanted. Any specific bequests?" Keller asked, scanning the page. "Nothing beyond what I've read," Mr. Keller said. "There are minor charitable donations to the Hayes Family Foundation, but those are to be administered at Mrs. Hayes's discretion." Margaret's discretion. That was the phrase that had ruled our lives. At her discretion, we'd attended certain schools and not others. At her discretion, we'd had screens or no screens. Friends or no friends. Celebrations or punishments. Now, that discretion wore a legal cloak. "So that's that," Eric said, leaning back in his chair, stretching his arms slightly, as if loosening tight muscles. "Clean. Efficient. Very him." He turned toward me, that familiar smugness softening to something almost magnanimous. "Books suit you," he said. "And 50 grand isn't nothing, Danny. You can finally fix that junker you drive." "Eric," my mother chided lightly, though she didn't disagree. "Don't be crass." She looked at me then, studying my face. I suddenly felt aware of the stubble on my jaw, the faint sheen of sweat on my forehead, the cheapness of my tie compared to the silk she'd bought for Eric on his first day at the firm. "We all knew how this would go," she said, her tone smoothing into that patient, reasonable register she used when explaining things to people she considered slow. "Your father was very traditional. Eldest son takes over. That doesn't mean he didn't care for you." A dozen memories flared up at once, crowding my throat. The time I'd come home with a black eye from intervening when some kids were beating up a smaller boy, and my father had shaken his head and said, "You can't save everyone, Daniel. Pick your battles." The day I'd told him I wanted to work in child protective services, and he'd scoffed. "You'll spend your life drowning in other people's bad decisions. You're throwing away your potential." The last real conversation I'd had with him, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and defeat, where he'd stared at the TV instead of me and murmured, "You still doing that social work thing?" like it tasted sour in his mouth. Maybe he had cared, in his own skewed, stunted way. But care without respect was like an apology without change. I swallowed all of that down. This wasn't the place. Not with their lawyer watching, not with paperwork still on the table. "Thank you for the clarity," I said instead, my voice coming out surprisingly even. "At least now there are no misunderstandings." My mother's eyes narrowed a fraction, as if searching for sarcasm. Eric snorted quietly. "If there are no further questions," Mr. Keller said, perhaps a bit too eagerly, "we can move on to the execution of the documents. There are a few things for each of you to sign acknowledging receipt and understanding." He pushed a stack of papers across the table. My mother took hers, flipping through briskly, barely skimming. Eric signed where indicated without really reading, accustomed to initialing away millions with a flick of his wrist. When the stack reached me, my name printed neatly at the top of a slim folder, my hand hovered for a moment. This is it, I thought. This is the moment the system closes around you and hardens. I scribbled my signature in the designated spaces, the ink soaking into the thick paper. Some people talked about will readings like they were dramatic, explosive events. Fights breaking out, shocking secrets revealed. In truth, most of them were probably like this, quiet brutality delivered with polite smiles. "All right," Mr. Keller said finally, gathering the signed forms, the shuffle of paper the only sound. "That concludes the reading of Robert Hayes's will." That's when I saw it. The shift. Aunt Cheryl had been quiet the whole time, her hands folded in her lap. Now she turned slightly, her gaze landing not on Keller, but on Jonathan Blake. There was something in her eyes I couldn't quite name. Expectation, maybe. Or nerves. Jonathan had been silent through the entire proceedings, his briefcase resting by his chair like a sleeping beast. Now he cleared his throat softly. "If I may," he said, his voice cutting through the room's stale air. "There is one more matter to address. Concerning your grandfather, Henry Hayes." My mother stiffened. "We already handled father's estate," she said quickly, the easy warmth draining from her tone. 2 years ago. Everything was settled." "Most of it, yes," Jonathan agreed calmly. "However, Mr. Hayes left one additional document to be opened only in the event of Robert Hayes's death. That condition has now been met." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I looked at him sharply, meeting his gaze for the first time since we'd sat down. There was something there I hadn't expected. Not pity, not triumph. Something like resolve. "What additional document?" my mother demanded, the smirk she'd worn all morning finally cracking. "Why wasn't I informed of this at the time of father's passing?" "Because he instructed me not to inform you, Mrs. Hayes," Jonathan said, and for the first time there was an edge in his voice. His exact words were, "They'll find out when it's time." Not a minute sooner. Eric laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "This is absurd," he said. "Granddad left the house to Aunt Cheryl, some cash to charity, and a few sentimental things. There's nothing else." "Your grandfather was a complex man," Jonathan replied. "He preferred to keep some of his arrangements private." He reached down and lifted the briefcase onto the table with a soft thud. The polished leather caught the light. The lock clicked as he spun the tiny dials and flipped it open. Inside, among neatly stacked folders, was a single thick, cream-colored envelope, its flaps sealed with dark red wax. The seal bore the Hayes family crest, the old one, the one my grandfather had insisted on even after my father had it redesigned for the corporate logo. My chest tightened. I'd seen envelopes like that before. Once, years ago, in my grandfather's desk drawer when I'd gone looking for a pen. He'd closed the drawer gently but firmly, his eyes meeting mine. "Some things have their own timing," he'd said. "Curiosity's a good trait, Daniel. But patience is better." Now, Jonathan picked up the envelope with both hands, treating it with a reverence I hadn't seen him show any of the documents so far. He checked the wax seal, then turned it so we could all see the front. In my grandfather's looping script, 3 words were written. "For my grandsons." The room's temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. My mother went very still. Eric shifted, his confident slouch suddenly looking forced. "For both of us?" he asked, frowning. "Then why wait until now? Why not just include it in his will?" Jonathan met his eyes evenly. "Because Mr. Hayes was very clear. This envelope was to remain sealed until after Robert's will had been read. He said people needed to show their true faces before the truth would matter to them. My pulse hammered in my ears. Show their true faces. I thought of my mother's satisfied smirk as my father's assets were parceled out. Of Eric's careless shrug when my name was followed by $50,000. Of the way nobody had looked at me except in that one brief moment of hesitation. I realized with a jolt that I was leaning forward in my chair now, hands flat on the table. Across from me, my mother noticed, her gaze snapping to my fingers as if offended by their presence on the polished wood. "This is highly irregular," she said tightly. "If there's some minor, sentimental note from father, we can handle it privately. There's no need to drag out." "With respect, Mrs. Hayes," Jonathan interrupted, and there was steel in his tone now. "Your father did not intend for this to be private. He specified that all direct heirs be present, which you are. So we will proceed, as per his instruction." He reached into his suit pocket and produced a small silver letter opener. It caught the light as it slid under the flap, the wax seal cracking with a faint, decisive snap. For a second, time seemed to stretch. The air in the room grew thick. I could hear my own breathing, the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, the distant hum of traffic outside. I thought of my grandfather's porch swing, of the smell of coffee and motor oil, of the way he'd once gripped my shoulder and said, "They'll always underestimate you, Daniel. That's not a curse. It's an advantage. Makes it easier to surprise them." The flap parted. Jonathan Blake reached into the envelope and drew out a sheaf of papers, thicker than a simple letter, but slimmer than a full legal contract. He scanned the first page quickly, his eyes moving in practiced rhythm. Then he looked up, his gaze settling on me first, then Eric, then my mother. "This," he said quietly, "is Henry Hayes's final letter of instruction. And it appears he had a great deal more to say than any of you realized." Jonathan adjusted his glasses and laid the pages flat on the table, like a dealer setting down a hand he already knew would change the game. He took a breath. "To my grandsons, Eric and Daniel," he began, reading in a slower, more deliberate cadence than Keller had used for my father's will. "I imagine, if you're hearing this, that your father's will has just been read. I also imagine you both already know how that went." The corner of his mouth twitched, like he could hear my grandfather's dry chuckle under the words. My mother bristled. "This is unnecessary," she muttered. Father always had a flair for drama. Jonathan didn't acknowledge her. He kept reading. Robert was many things, smart, stubborn, tireless. But he also believed too much in old rules. Eldest son gets the business. Younger sons make do. It was the way my father did it, and the way his father did it before him. Tradition, they call it. I call it lazy. Aunt Cheryl let out an involuntary snort that she covered with a cough. Eric's jaw tightened. "When I built Hayes Industrial, I did not do it so that one child could wear the crown and the other be handed crumbs. I did it so that this family would never have to bow to anyone again." Somewhere along the line, Robert forgot that part. I felt something loosen in my chest. Just a fraction. Like a knot that had been tied for years had been pulled on at last. "Make no mistake," Jonathan continued. "Your father was a good businessman. He grew what I started. He turned a small factory into an empire. For that, I'm proud of him. But he also started to believe his press. Started to think the company and the family began and ended with him and the boy he decided would walk in his footsteps." He looked up briefly. Eric's ears had gone faintly pink. "Eric," Jonathan read, eyes back on the page, "you have your father's confidence. The world has always opened doors for you. You're smart, and you know how to use a room. That's not nothing. But you've also been told, since the day you were born, that everything would be handed to you. You've been allowed to believe effort is optional, because someone will always fix the mess." Eric shifted in his chair. "That's not." "Eric," my mother hissed, fingers digging into his sleeve. "Let him finish." Jonathan's voice softened just slightly on the next line. "Daniel," he read, "you were never told the doors were open. You were told to be grateful for any crack in the frame. You're stubborn like me. You keep doing the right thing even when no one's watching. That's worth more than a corner office full of people nodding along because your name's on the door." For a heartbeat, the room disappeared. It was just me and my grandfather, sitting on that porch swing, his hand warm and heavy on my shoulder. Hearing him call that stubbornness a fault and a gift, depending on the day. I swallowed hard. My mother's lips thinned. "He always coddled you. she said, like she needed to put that on the record. Jonathan turned a page. When I sat down with Jonathan here to draw up my will, he continued, I split things the way Margaret and Robert expected. The house, the savings, the little stuff. Gave Cheryl what she needed so she'd never have to come begging to her brother's door. Send a chunk to charity. That kept everyone calm. But there was one thing I did not put in that first will. He glanced at Keller, whose face had gone oddly blank. My voting shares in Hayes Industrial. The words dropped like a stone in water. Ripples radiated outward in invisible rings. My brain snagged. You're what? I heard myself say before I could stop it. My mother's head snapped toward Jonathan. That's impossible, she said sharply. Robert owned the company. He bought your shares years ago. We have the paperwork. Jonathan met her gaze with the practiced patience of a man who'd spent his life untangling other people's illusions. With respect, Mrs. Hayes, he said, your husband bought a portion of your father-in-law's shares. A significant portion, yes. But Henry retained controlling voting interest until his death. He then placed those remaining shares into a separate trust that was not part of the general probate process, per his explicit instructions. Keller shifted in his chair, looking suddenly smaller. Henry always liked his side deals, he muttered. Aunt Cheryl shot him a look that clearly said, you knew. How many shares? Eric demanded, leaning forward. Some of the polish had worn off his tone. What percentage? Jonathan consulted the next page. 51% of total voting stock, he said calmly, leaving your father with a substantial, but not controlling, stake. The room spun for a second. All my life, I'd heard about my father owning the company. About him being the king, not the steward. It had been fact, unchallenged, the way we said water was wet. Now, with one sentence, that fact cracked. My grandfather had never truly let go. Absolutely not, my mother snapped, her eyes blazing. This is some clerical error. Father wouldn't have done that without telling Robert. Without telling me. Your father did a great many things without telling you, Aunt Cheryl said quietly. My mother shot her a look of pure betrayal. You knew? I knew he still had some cards up his sleeve, Cheryl replied. He told me he wasn't going to let tradition ruin another generation. Jonathan read on, unruffled. If you're hearing this, he quoted, it means I'm gone and so is Robert. It also means the company is now in the hands of whoever he decided deserved it. Or thought deserved it. I've seen enough fathers give everything to one child and nothing to another and call it justice. I won't pretend I didn't make mistakes with my own kids, but I'm not going to sit quietly while my grandsons relive the same damn story. He turned the page, the paper whispering. So here's how this is going to go. He looked up at us all, then back down. My remaining shares in Hayes Industrial, the ones that, taken together, give controlling voting interest, shall pass in their entirety to my grandson, Daniel Hayes. The words didn't register at first. They were sounds, syllables, hanging in the air. To my grandson, Daniel Hayes. It was like hearing my name called in a language I'd only ever read on a page. What? Eric's chair scraped loudly as he shot halfway to his feet. That's insane. He barely understands the business. Be very careful what you say next, Aunt Cheryl cut in, her voice low but sharp enough to slice. Your grandfather chose his words. He didn't do anything by accident. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. Is this legal? I managed, looking from Jonathan to Keller. Jonathan gave a single, emphatic nod. Absolutely. The trust documents were executed, notarized, and filed. The board has been aware that a controlling interest was held in trust since Henry's death. They just didn't know who the beneficiary would be. That was sealed until today. Keller cleared his throat. He's correct, he said reluctantly. Your father, Henry, was always very deliberate. He made it clear these shares were to follow his letter, not the general distribution of his estate. My mother looked like someone had slapped her. This is absurd, she whispered. Daniel has never. He isn't, she floundered for words, falling back on the only measure she truly believed in. He doesn't live in our world. No, I thought hollowly. I don't. I live in the world the company chewed up and spat out. Jonathan continued reading, merciless in his calm. Eric, he read. Before you start shouting, hear me out. That pulled Eric up short. His mouth snapped closed, teeth clicking audibly. I am not punishing you, the letter went on. You inherit plenty from your father. The house. Cash. His shares. That's more than most men see in a lifetime. But you don't need my votes on top of that. You've had your hand on the wheel your whole life. Whether you keep it there will now depend on something you've never really had to show before. Humility. A strange, strangled sound escaped Eric's throat. Daniel, Jonathan read, and I felt my chest constrict. I know you probably want no part of that boardroom. Part of me is glad. The company has taken enough from our family. But whether you sit at that table or not, I need you to understand this. You are not less than your brother. Not in my eyes. Not in any way that matters. The pen I'd been clutching slipped out of my fingers and rolled across the table, stopping near my father's lawyer's hand. Nobody moved to pick it up. I've watched you your whole life, the letter said. Watched you show up for people who had nothing to give you back. Watched you choose work that doesn't come with headlines. That's the kind of man I'd trust with power. Because you know what it's like not to have it. My vision blurred. I blinked hard, unwilling to let tears fall in front of them. So I'm giving you mine, Jonathan read. What you do with it is up to you. You can step in and clean up whatever mess Robert left behind. You can sell the damn thing and walk away. You can hand your votes to someone you trust and go back to your life. But for once in this family's long, loud history, the choice will belong to the one person who was never expected to have a say. The room was utterly silent. Outside the window, a car horn blared faintly and then faded. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang twice and stopped. At the table, you could have heard a pin drop. My mother was the first to find her voice. This is outrageous, she said, each word clipped. We will contest. Father was clearly declining when he wrote that. He was sentimental. Manipulated. You. Careful, Jonathan said quietly. Henry was evaluated for competency by an independent physician the day he executed these documents. I have the report in this case. Any challenge would be ill-advised. What kind of sick game was he playing? Eric demanded, turning his anger toward me, because that's where it had always gone when things didn't break his way. You don't know the first thing about running a corporation, Danny. You're going to what? Stroll in from your little government office and start bossing around people who've been doing this for decades. I met his stare and, for the first time in my life, didn't look away. I don't have to do anything, I said slowly. That's the point. It's my choice. The words felt foreign in my mouth. My choice. Not an apology. Not a justification. A fact. Jonathan cleared his throat gently. There's one more paragraph, he said. He looked back down. One last thing, he read. To both of you. If either of you attempt to contest these instructions in court, your share of my estate is to be reduced to $1. Cheryl gets the rest. I've had enough of lawyers getting rich off family grudges. Aunt Cheryl raised her eyebrows. Well, she said lightly. For once, I approve of one of his schemes. My mother's face went white. She opened her mouth and then closed it again. I could almost see the calculations happening behind her eyes. The scenarios. The odds. She wasn't used to being checkmated. So that's it? She whispered finally, looking at me like I'd personally orchestrated this. You get to decide what happens to everything your grandfather and father built? After all the years After all the years you what? Aunt Cheryl cut in, her patience evidently gone. Pretended one of your sons didn't exist? Threw him a bone and called it mercy. Margaret's head snapped toward her. You have no idea what it was like raising two boys and a husband who lived at the office. I had a pretty good view from next door, Cheryl said. Henry did too. He just waited too damn long to say anything. They were slipping into old battles, ones I'd only ever seen the edges of. I let their voices fade into a distant buzz. All my attention had tunneled down to the papers in front of me. My name, grandfather's signature, the words controlling interest. I'd spent my entire adult life finding ways to work around the damage this company left in its wake. Kids whose parents worked double shifts at Hayes Industrial and still couldn't afford daycare. Families thrown off their land when a new plant needed somewhere to go. Layoffs timed conveniently to avoid paying out benefits. I'd seen what Hayes Holdings meant at the bottom. Now, sitting here, I held a piece of it that actually mattered. A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep in my chest. It wasn't funny, not in any ordinary sense. It was disbelief and shock and something like grim delight all tangled together. Granddad, I whispered under my breath. You crazy old man. Jonathan folded the pages carefully and slid them back into the envelope, now split open. For the record, he said, slipping back into professional mode. We'll need Daniel to meet with the board in the coming week. They'll require proof of his identity as beneficiary and some reassurance regarding his intentions. All eyes swung to me. My mother's, full of wounded outrage. Eric's, blazing with insulted entitlement. Cheryl's, weary but hopeful. Keller's, cautious. Jonathan's, steady and proud, maybe. I thought of the kids on my caseload. Of the woman last month who'd cried in my office when I'd told her we'd found a safe placement for her son. Of the nights I'd come home too tired to eat and collapsed on my couch, wondering if any of it mattered in the face of systems so much bigger than me. And then I thought of my grandfather, drawing lines on a napkin, showing me how voting blocks worked when I was 15. You don't have to be the one swinging the hammer, he'd said. You just have to make sure whoever is remembers who's holding the handle. I took a breath. The air tasted different now. I'll meet with them, I said quietly. But I'm not promising anything today. I need time to think. Eric made a disgusted sound. You're going to sit on your hands while the company flounders? Real responsible, Dan. The company has been floundering under your watch for years, Cheryl shot back. Maybe a little hesitation is exactly what it needs. Ms. Hayes, Keller warned, but there was no real conviction in it. I pushed back my chair and stood. My legs felt strangely steady, given the earthquake that had just ripped through my life. I appreciate you following his wishes, I said to Jonathan. It felt inadequate, but there weren't words for what I wanted to say. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for being the messenger of the one person who ever did. He inclined his head. He was very clear, Daniel. He wanted you to have a choice. Don't waste it. My mother rose too, her chair scraping loudly. This isn't over, she said, low enough that only I and Eric could hear. You may have those papers, but you don't understand what you're meddling with. I met her gaze and, for once, saw not just anger there, but fear. I understand more than you think, I replied. I've been living with the fallout since before I could spell our name. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She turned away. Eric didn't say anything. He just stared at me, something raw and sharp in his eyes. It wasn't just about money for him, either. It was about identity, about the story he'd been told his whole life, that he was the heir, the center, the inevitable. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. I stepped out of the conference room into the corridor. The air out there felt cooler, cleaner. I leaned against the wall for a second, closing my eyes. My heart was still pounding, but beneath the adrenaline was a strange, steadying calm. I hadn't asked for this. I hadn't schemed for it. I hadn't even dreamed it, because dreams like that were dangerous in my family. They set you up for a fall off a very tall pedestal. But now that it was in my hands, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I was not going to become them. It's been a year since that morning in the lawyer's office. Sometimes, when I'm driving to work, my real work, the one with the peeling linoleum and the cheap coffee, it still hits me. On paper, I control a multi-billion-dollar empire. In practice, I don't sit in that boardroom every day. I didn't move into my parents' house or buy a new car or quit my job to sip scotch in some corner office. Granddad had been right. The company had chewed up enough of this family. I went to that initial board meeting, sat at the long, glossy table while men and women in expensive suits assessed me like I was a wild card in their well-shuffled deck. Some of them were openly skeptical. Some were careful, promising support as long as things stayed stable. A few, the ones who'd known my grandfather in the early days, studied me with something like recognition in their eyes. I told them the truth, that I wasn't a businessman, that I had no desire to play CEO, that my priorities, if I stayed, would look very different from my father's and brothers. We negotiated. We argued. We found common ground. In the end, I made a choice that felt like mine, not an echo of anyone else. I kept the voting shares. I refused a board salary. I backed a candidate for CEO who wasn't related to me by blood or by golf course. A woman from outside the Hayes orbit who had a track record of turning companies around without grinding people into dust. Eric fought it, of course. For 3 tense months, every vote was a battle. He tried to rally old allies, paint me as naive, reckless. Some days, I thought he might succeed. Then the numbers started to shift. Employee turnover slowed. Accident reports dropped. Communities that had once cursed our name cautiously started returning our calls. Profits took a temporary hit, then began to climb again, steadier this time, not powered by panicked cuts and shiny acquisitions. It turned out you could run a company without treating people like disposable parts. Who knew? On the family side, things are complicated. My mother sends me emails occasionally, mostly logistical. Updates about the sale of some vacation property. Requests for signatures. At Christmas, she mailed a card with a pre-printed verse and a signature that looked rushed. We haven't had a real conversation since that day. Maybe we never will. Eric and I see each other at board meetings. He nods now when I walk into the room. Sometimes he even asks my opinion, though his jaw clenches when I give it. Once, after a particularly tense session, he caught up with me in the parking garage. "Do you ever think about how it could have been?" he'd asked abruptly, leaning against a concrete pillar, the veneer of arrogance stripped away by exhaustion. "How what could have been?" I'd said, "If Dad had treated us the same," he said, staring at the oil stains on the floor. "If Granddad had split things the way everyone expected. If you and I didn't have all this baggage." I'd thought about it, more times than I cared to admit. "I think we'd still have found ways to mess it up," I said honestly. "Just different ones." He'd laughed, a short, surprised sound. Then he'd nodded and walked away. "We're not close. We may never be. But the story isn't as simple as it used to be." Golden child. Disappointment. Some days, I think that's the real gift Granddad left us. The chance to be something other than caricatures of our parents' expectations. As for me, I still park my 10-year-old car in the lot outside the county office building 3 days a week. I still sit across from scared kids and tired parents and try to bend systems that weren't built with them in mind. The difference now is that when I see a policy that hurts more than it helps, I have somewhere to send a very well-funded email. A few months after that while reading, I set up a foundation in my grandfather's name, the Henry and Daniel Hayes Fund. It doesn't have a fancy logo. We don't throw galas. But every year, a quiet stream of money flows from those Hayes industrial dividends into after-school programs, legal aid clinics, community health centers, into the kind of places my family's company helped break. Some nights, when the office is finally quiet, I pull that old, yellowing envelope out of my desk. The one Granddad gave me the day I moved into the dorms. The emergency fund I never cashed. I never needed the money, but I needed what it represented. "Sometimes you need a little cushion to make brave choices," he'd said. He was still giving me cushions, all the way from the grave. People ask me, sometimes, if I feel like I got revenge. I think about my mother's face when Jonathan read my name. About Eric's stunned silence. About the way their certainty cracked. But I also think about my grandfather's letter. About how tired he must have been when he wrote it. Tired of watching the same patterns repeat. Revenge, if you want to call it that, wasn't in taking something from them. It was in refusing to become what they'd tried to make me. In sitting at that long table and saying, calmly, "No, we're not doing it that way anymore." In remembering that legacy, the way Granddad defined it, isn't what you hoard. It's what you hand on. He handed me the handle of a hammer I never expected to hold. I could have used it to smash everything. Instead, I'm trying, day by day, to build something different. Something he might have been proud to see swinging from his porch swing, coffee in hand, watching his stubborn grandson learn, finally, that being underestimated is only a disadvantage if you let it be.